Sound is wrong. That is the first thing you notice. Standing on the plain near the Orfidian River, in what is now the Puglia region of southern Italy, on the morning of August 3rd, 216 BC, the sound is wrong. Yesterday, this field held somewhere between 80 and 100,000 men. Yesterday, in the span of a single afternoon, the largest Roman army ever assembled was surrounded, compressed into an ever-tightening ring, and destroyed almost entirely. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, one of Rome's two senior commanders for the year, was dead somewhere in the mass of fallen. 29 military tribunes were dead. Approximately 80 men of senatorial rank were dead. The surviving consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, had escaped from Cannae with perhaps 50 soldiers. The Battle of Cannae was over by early evening on August 2nd. By morning, the field is quiet. But quiet is not the same as still. The flies have found this place. The birds have found it. In the direction of the river, at a distance that carries only the vaguest impression of sound, there is organized activity, men working with purpose, without urgency, because the urgency was yesterday. Whatever is happening on this field this morning, it is not a battle. The battle is finished. Most documentaries about Rome end here. The engagement, the outcome, the historical significance, and then on to the next chapter, the next commander, the next campaign. The Battle of Cannae gets 45 minutes, and then we move forward in time. This video begins here, because what happened on this field in the 48 hours after the last man fell, and what happened after every significant Roman engagement across 4 centuries, is almost never discussed in popular history. What the Roman army actually did in the 2 days following a major battle is the most systematically overlooked aspect of Roman military power. It is not glorious in the way that formations and commanders are glorious. It is something else. It is efficient. It is institutional. It is, in its way, more revealing about what Rome actually was than anything that happened in the 6 hours that preceded it. You know how Rome fought. The legions, the discipline, the tactics that military academies still study, the commanders whose names are still familiar 2,000 years later. You know the battles. You may not know the machine. This is the story of the machine. The cavalry left first. In Roman military doctrine across both the Republican and Imperial periods, infantry was the decisive arm, but infantry was not designed for pursuit. The legions were built to advance under control, hold a line, and grind forward. The moment the enemy formation broke and men began to run, the legionaries' role was essentially finished. They stepped aside. That was when the cavalry went. The orders were specific, and they were consistent across Roman military history. Pursue, kill, or capture. Allow no one to escape this field who can fight again. The logic was direct, and it governed Roman pursuit doctrine for generations. A defeated enemy who escapes today becomes the campaign you have to fight next year. A defeated enemy who does not escape is a military problem that is closed. So while the cavalry rode out fast, systematic, moving through the roads and fields and riverside scrub beyond the main engagement, the legions had their own work. And the work began almost immediately after the final Roman formations relaxed. The capsarii moved first through the Roman sections of the field. These were the medical corpsmen. Attached to each unit bandages was the literal meaning of the word. And that was where they started, though they did considerably more. They wore the same equipment as regular soldiers, by design, because in combat their job required them to move where the fighting was. But now, in the aftermath, they moved differently through the fallen with purpose, identifying the living, applying tourniquets cut from narrow bronze strips lined with leather, cleaning wounds with vinegar, packing open tissue with linen bandages soaked in honey, beeswax, spider webs in some cases, which contain natural antifungal compounds that Roman physicians understood through observation rather than chemistry. Every wounded Roman soldier who could be moved was loaded onto a stretcher or a covered wagon and evacuated to the valetudinarium, the field hospital, before nightfall, if at all possible. The doctrine was explicit. Cornelius Celsus, writing in the 1st century AD and drawing on established Roman medical tradition, stated it clearly. Wounds must be treated on the day they are received, not the following morning. That same day. Because a wound left overnight becomes an infected wound by morning, and an infected wound in an age without antibiotics was the path from survival to death by gangrene. The timing of treatment was not a matter of comfort. It was the difference between sending a soldier back to the line in a month and carrying another body to the burial detail. At Cannae, specifically, the capsari were not working the whole field. They were working the Roman sections of it, because on this particular morning the field belonged to Hannibal. Livy, writing his History of Rome roughly 2 centuries after the battle, describes what Carthaginian soldiers found as they moved through the aftermath of Cannae. Thousands of Roman wounded who had lost consciousness during the night, who woke in the morning cold among the dead, trying to rise. Some of those men were killed where they lay. Others, Livy records, laid bare their necks and throats and asked to be finished. They understood what the morning meant. They understood who controlled the ground. This is what the morning after a battle looked like, even for the victors on their own side of the field. Not triumph, not silence. Process. 2 simultaneous processes operating by entirely different rules on the same stretch of ground. But there is something else on this field. Something almost no popular account of Roman warfare ever mentions. Something that was not a soldier, not a commander, not a physician. Something that had been waiting at a careful distance since before the fighting started, watching, listening for the cavalry to return and the sounds of organized resistance to collapse. The moment they did, it started moving toward the Roman camp. They were merchants. Not merchants in the way we typically imagine. Not men with cloth and pottery and grain. These men dealt in a single commodity, and the commodity was human beings. The Romans had specific words for them: mangones, venalici, professional slave traders, and they followed the Roman army on campaign, not as casual camp followers, but as a functional component of the military machine. Their presence was not accidental. It was expected. It was, in a sense, planned for. After a significant Roman victory, within hours of the last organized resistance collapsing, the commercial machinery of prisoner processing was already in motion. This was not improvisation. This was infrastructure. The sorting process began quickly, and it followed an established logic. Prisoners were assessed on sight, age, physical condition, sex, evidence of skills, or social status. A young, physically healthy prisoner, male or female, commanded a higher price than an elderly one. A prisoner who displayed signs of education or specialized craft skill could command a higher price still. A captured enemy nobleman or commander occupied a separate category. Entirely such figures were held apart, either for potential ransom, for display in the eventual triumph procession in Rome, or for execution at that triumph's end. The legal and financial framework for all of this was formalized Roman doctrine. The commanding general held authority over the distribution of battlefield captives. Some were allocated to the state. Some were distributed directly to soldiers as personal booty, a deliberate policy on the part of certain commanders that functioned as both reward and incentive for future service. The bulk was sold to the dealers who were already present, the cash flowing into the campaign's financial accounts under the supervision of the quaestor, the military financial officer attached to the command. The formal public auction, when conditions allowed for it, was known as a sale sub hasta, a spear driven upright into the earth as the symbol and legal marker of a military commercial transaction. To understand the actual scale of what happened in the 48 hours following a Roman victory, you need specific numbers. Those numbers come from ancient sources that carry the inherent uncertainty of their era. Ancient writers sometimes exaggerated, sometimes worked from incomplete records, and always wrote from their own cultural and political perspectives. With that acknowledged, the figures that survive across multiple independent sources are worth examining. At the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, the siege engagement that effectively ended organized Gallic resistance to Julius Caesar, Caesar records in his own account that after the victory, he distributed one Gallic captive to each of his soldiers as personal booty. He had approximately 80,000 men under his command at Alesia. 80,000 people distributed in a single organized operation in the days following a single battle. Let that sit for a moment. In 57 BC, during his campaign against the Belgic tribes, Caesar sold 53,000 members of the Atuatuci people in a single transaction to the slave dealers traveling with his army. That figure appears across multiple ancient sources and is considered relatively credible by modern historians, though, as with all ancient numbers, the precise count cannot be confirmed. In 167 BC, after the Battle of Pydna had ended Macedonian independence, the Roman commander Aemilius Paulus moved his army through the region of Epirus, the territory corresponding to modern northwestern Greece and southern Albania. According to Livy, writing from earlier annalistic records, Paulus oversaw a coordinated operation across 70 Epirote towns in a single campaign season. The total enslaved in that operation was 150,000 people. Modern historians generally regard that figure as within the range of credibility, though they acknowledge it cannot be independently verified. After the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD, when Titus's forces sacked Jerusalem, the historian Josephus, who was present for the campaign, records that 97,000 people were taken captive from the city and its surroundings. The enormous wealth extracted from the Jewish campaign, Josephus and later sources note, was used in part to fund one of Rome's most iconic structures. The Colosseum, which still stands in the center of modern Rome, was built in significant part with the proceeds of the Jerusalem campaign. The Colosseum, funded by the people taken from Jerusalem in 70 AD, that is not a metaphor or a rhetorical flourish. That is, the machine made visible in stone and mortar, still standing. The British Museum, drawing on a range of modern scholarship, estimates that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the entire Roman Empire's population may have been enslaved at the height of Roman power. For an empire of approximately 50 million people in the 1st century AD, that lower estimate alone represents 5 million human beings living in slavery. The primary mechanism feeding that supply through the Republican period especially, and continuing into the Principate, was the battlefield. Not the only source, but the largest and most reliable one. Slave traders followed the legions on campaign because the legions reliably produced captives, and the captives reliably produced profit. It was a commercial relationship built into the logistical structure of Roman warfare, as regular and predictable as the supply wagons that followed the army with grain. When Roman armies campaigned, the slave trade expanded. When Augustus pacified the Mediterranean after decades of civil war and the major conquest campaigns diminished, the supply from warfare contracted and other sources had to compensate. Understanding this does not require condemning Rome in terms it would never have recognized. Almost every major ancient civilization enslaved its defeated enemies. What distinguished Rome was not the institution, but the infrastructure surrounding it, the speed, the legal framework, the commercial integration with the military machine, the efficiency of the chain from battlefield to market. The slave traders were there before the fighting ended. The legal apparatus for the transaction was established doctrine. The auction was a formality that completed within days what the battle had begun. The physical legacy of this system is everywhere in the Rome we study. The latifundia, the great agricultural estates of Italy, ran on enslaved labor, labor that arrived from Gaul and Greece and Carthage and Judea and 100 other places where Roman armies had fought and won. The surplus wealth that funded Rome's public building programs, the temples and forums and aqueducts and roads that define Roman civilization in our imagination, traced back through the financial records of Roman campaigns to the auctions that happened in the days after the fighting stopped. This supply chain had a geography. Prisoners taken on the Rhine frontier made their way south along Roman roads to markets in Gaul and Italy. Prisoners from the eastern campaigns passed through the slave market at Delos, which Rome had made a free port specifically to facilitate the trade before dispersing across the Mediterranean world. Strabo, writing in the early 1st century AD, describes the Delos market as capable of processing 10,000 people in a single day during its peak period. 10,000 in a single day. The scale of the operation that followed Roman military expansion was not hidden or informal. It was one of the most visible commercial institutions in the ancient world. The economic consequence shaped everything. The great agricultural estates of Italy, the latifundia that displaced small farmers, that concentrated land ownership in fewer and fewer hands, that created the social pressures that eventually drove the Gracchi reforms and contributed to the instability of the late Republic. Those estates ran on enslaved labor, and that labor arrived from the field. The dispossession of the Italian small farmer and the expansion of slave-staffed estates were not separate processes from the military campaigns. They were downstream consequences of the same machine. The 48 hours after a battle in Spain, or Greece, or Gaul had effects in the Italian countryside that persisted for generations. The battles are famous. The machine that followed them built the empire. But the prisoners were only one part of what those 48 hours contained. While the commercial operation was working the perimeter of the Roman camp, the men who had survived the battle were managing something different. Exhaustion first. The kind that arrives when the adrenaline finally leaves the body completely. A Roman legionary in a pitched engagement advancing on foot, in armor that could weigh 30 pounds or more, throwing javelins and then closing to sword distance and fighting at close range, might sustain hours of peak physical exertion under conditions of extreme psychological pressure. The crash, when it ended, was significant. Sleep was the first need for most men. Food and water were the second. But there was a third thing. And this is what Roman commanders feared in the hours after a victory, more than almost anything except a counterattack. Expectation. A Roman soldier, particularly in the Republican period, had a specific and entirely practical relationship to the question of battlefield reward. The booty system, known in its general form as the preda, was one of the primary means by which warfare compensated the men who did it. This was not a minor consideration. In the earlier Republic, before the Marian reforms and the professionalization of the legions, Roman soldiers were essentially citizens under arms, who provided their own equipment and whose primary form of material return from campaigning was a share of what the campaign produced. The captured arms and equipment, what the Romans called spolia, had specific legal and religious significance. The coins and valuables stripped from the enemy dead, the allocation from the prisoner sales, the distribution of movable plunder from captured camps or cities. This was legitimate compensation that soldiers calculated with as much precision as any modern laborer calculating wages. The problem was what this calculation looked like in practice. In the hours after a major battle, with thousands of men tired and emotionally volatile on a field where the line between authorized recovery of legitimate booty and unauthorized violence was, in the dark, a line that could be crossed almost without noticing. Julius Caesar describes the danger with unusual candor in his account of the campaign in Gaul. At Gergovia, in 52 BC, a battle that did not end as a clean Roman victory, Caesar explicitly criticizes his soldiers for losing discipline after an initial tactical success. They advanced without orders, he records. They pushed beyond their objectives. They were, in his characterization, rapacious and impulsive, in a way that cost the army the advantages it had worked to create. That passage is rare in the ancient sources. Commanders did not typically include their soldiers' failures in their own campaign memoirs. Caesar included it because the lesson mattered to him, and because what had happened at Gergovia was the specific failure the post-battle command structure was designed to prevent. The disciplinary machinery the Romans maintained for exactly this situation was severe in concept, even when it was infrequently applied in its full form. The fustuarium death by clubbing at the hands of your own comrades for specific offences against military discipline is documented by Polybius as a standard punishment in Roman military law. Decimation, the systematic execution of one soldier in 10 from a unit that had failed catastrophically, was documented enough to be a genuine cultural memory, used rarely but sufficiently that the threat carried weight. The backbone of day-to-day discipline in the Roman military was the centurionate, the professional career officers who commanded at the unit level, who were present during and after every engagement, who knew their men individually, and whose authority was the human mechanism by which the post-battle hours were kept from descending into chaos. It did not always work. The ancient sources suggest that post-battle disorder was a recurring challenge, not an exception. The institutional response was characteristically Roman: simultaneous pressure and release. The disciplinary threat on one hand, legitimate distribution of reward on the other. Soldiers who received their recognized share through the authorized process had less incentive to take it through unauthorized means. Soldiers who saw the authorized process moving quickly and fairly were less likely to go looking for alternatives. And while the booty distribution and discipline management were operating, the medical system was at full capacity. Rome's approach to military medicine was, by the standards of the ancient world, exceptional in ways that deserve to be stated clearly rather than implied. The formal military medical corps that most people associate with Roman armies was actually established relatively late by Emperor Augustus, after 27 BC, as part of the reorganization of the military following the long civil wars. Before Augustus, capable commanders like Caesar had brought physicians with their armies, but this was personal initiative, a commander's individual decision. Augustus made it doctrine. He created the first formal professional military medical service in recorded history. The structure had several layers: the capsari for immediate field care. Behind them, the Medici Ordinarii soldiers with formal medical training who handled more complex injuries outside of the immediate combat environment. At the highest level, the medicus chirurgus, the surgeon who operated from the valetudinarium, the military field hospital. A valetudinarium in a permanent legionary fortress could accommodate 200 to 300 patients. It was built to specific architectural principles that the Romans understood empirically: central courtyard for light and air circulation, patient rooms arranged around a corridor to allow isolation of serious cases from minor injuries, location within the fortress chosen for proximity to clean water and distance from drainage. The ruins of military hospitals at Vindonissa in modern Switzerland, at Nove on the Danube in Bulgaria, and at sites along the Rhine frontier confirm that these were not improvised facilities. They were engineered spaces built to a consistent plan across the width of the empire. Cornelius Celsus documented over 100 distinct surgical instruments in his medical writing. Those instruments have been found archaeologically at Roman military sites: scalpels, probes, forceps, specialized tools for extracting arrowheads and javelin points without enlarging the wound channel, bone saws for amputations, and trepanning, instruments for relieving pressure from skull fractures. Opium poppy extract for analgesia, black henbane for sedation. Both contain compounds morphine and scopolamine that modern pharmacology confirms as genuinely effective. Roman military medicine did not understand the chemistry, it understood the effect. The distance between empirical ancient knowledge and modern explanatory science is, in this domain, considerably smaller than most people assume. The ancient physician Galen, who became Rome's most influential medical writer, learned part of his surgical technique at a gladiatorial school in Pergamon before serving the legions. The gladiatorial school, it turned out, was excellent training for military surgery. Both created a consistent supply of men with specific, severe, traumatic wounds that required immediate, skilled intervention. The knowledge transferred. There is something in this that deserves more than a moment. The same institutional machine that had been sorting human beings for commercial sale in the hours after a victory was simultaneously operating what was genuinely the most advanced emergency medical service in the ancient world, not as charity, not as sentiment, but as a calculated investment in recoverable assets. A trained legionary represented years of institutional expense. A wounded legionary who could be returned to service after recovery was worth more to the Roman military system than a dead one. The medical corps was, among its other functions, an asset recovery operation. Later, under the Emperor Hadrian, in the 2nd century AD, something more complex entered the legal record. A rescript, a formal imperial legal response to a query about military law, addressed the case of soldiers who took their own lives as a consequence of the mental suffering caused by their service. Such men, Hadrian's rescript determined, should not have their estates treated the same way as soldiers who died by suicide for other reasons. The language is careful and legalistic, as Roman legal language always was. But underneath the formality is a recognition that deserves to be named. The Roman state formally acknowledged, in law, that war left lasting damage in the minds of the men who fought it, and that this damage could have consequences extending well beyond the field. Modern scholars debate carefully how to interpret this evidence across a distance of 2,000 years. Applying a contemporary clinical category to men who lived within a radically different cultural framework for understanding violence and suffering is a step the evidence does not fully support. What ancient sources document are behaviors, veterans unable to readjust to civilian life, accounts of disturbed conduct, fragmentary inscriptions that describe persistent disruption after combat. Whether those behaviors constitute what we now call a specific psychiatric disorder is a question that cannot be definitively answered from literary texts alone. What seems clear is this. Rome was aware enough of the problem to build a legal accommodation for one of its consequences. That awareness itself is part of the 48 hours, the recognition, however imprecisely expressed in the language of imperial Roman law, that the men who came back from these fields were not entirely the same as the men who had left. Now consider the dead. The dead on a post-battlefield were subject to an entirely different logic than the living, and the decisions made about them in those 48 hours were neither purely practical nor purely ceremonial. They were strategic, and the strategy was applied differently depending on whose dead they were. Begin with the Roman dead. The image most people carry of Roman military commemoration is constructed from the tombstones. Thousands have survived across the former Roman world, inscribed stone markers bearing names, units, ages, years of service, and occasionally brief personal details that make individual soldiers feel briefly present across 2 millennia. They are distributed along the roads outside Roman cities, in museums, in the countryside where legionary fortresses once stood. They are an unusually personal body of evidence, one that allows us to meet individual Roman soldiers by name. What almost none of those tombstones record is death in battle. This is counterintuitive in a way that takes a moment to register fully. The Roman soldier who died fighting in a major engagement, in the kind of battle that history records and documentaries reconstruct, did not typically receive an individual stone marker. He received a mass grave, usually unmarked on the surface, his remains mixed with hundreds or thousands of others in the same trench. His name was not individually recorded for posterity. He joined an anonymous majority. The scholarly record on this point is clear. Academic research into Roman battlefield burial has confirmed that almost all surviving Roman military tombstones belong to soldiers who died off the battlefield of disease, of accident, in garrison, after a full career. The soldier who died at Cannae or at Pydna or in the forests beyond the Rhine received the minimum religious requirement, the oiusta sepultura, the proper burial, which Cicero in his Laws defines as requiring at minimum the casting of earth upon the bones to make the grave a sacred place and not much beyond it. The practical reasons for this are easy to understand. A field covered with tens of thousands of unburied human and animal bodies in the summer heat of southern Italy becomes a public health crisis within a day. The rapid clearance and mass burial of the Roman dead was necessary, urgent, and handled efficiently. The religious minimum was met. The field was cleared. But the contrast with peacetime military commemoration is difficult to ignore, and the Romans themselves were aware of it. The soldier who died in garrison in a Rhine fortress town received the tombstone, the funeral club benefit he had been paying into his whole career, the inscription that would persist long after everyone who knew him was gone. The soldier who died in the battle that frontier fortress was built to support disappeared into an anonymous mound with hundreds of others, unmarked. Elite commanders were the partial exception. In earlier Republican practice, the remains of generals and senior officers could sometimes be returned to Rome. Appian, in his account of the civil wars, mentions a legal change that directed the dead, including important dead to be buried on the battlefield, to spare the civilian population of Rome from the distress of bodies being transported home. Either way, the ordinary soldier's anonymity was consistent. Now consider the enemy dead. The decision about what to do with them was entirely at the commanding general's discretion, and it was never a purely practical decision. It was a political instrument. In the Roman religious and cultural framework, one shared to a significant degree with the Greek world and with many of Rome's Mediterranean neighbors. The unburied dead occupied a liminal and disturbing position. Horace wrote about it. Cicero wrote about it. Virgil wrote about it at length in the Aeneid, where the unburied dead at the entrance to the underworld cannot cross the river to whatever comes after, trapped between worlds, restless and dangerous to the living. This was not merely poetic decoration. It was a genuine cultural and religious belief held by the communities Rome was fighting. To leave an enemy's dead unburied was to condemn them, in the belief system of everyone who loved them, to a state of permanent disturbance. Rome knew this, and Rome used it deliberately. In civil wars, battles fought against other Romans, which Roman law and tradition found culturally difficult to accommodate in formal ways, while being entirely capable of conducting in practice, the defeated army's dead were frequently left unburied as a calculated act of dominance. Their bodies could lie exposed for months. In some documented cases, for years. The families of the dead could not mourn in the full ritual sense. The communities of the defeated could not close the wound. The weapon of non-burial was inexpensive to deploy, required no maintenance, and continued to do its work for as long as the bones remained on the ground. But the most complete and most documented example of this weapon's use in Roman military history is not a civil war. It is the aftermath of the Teutoburg forest. In the autumn of 9 AD, the Roman governor of the Germanic territories, Publius Quinctilius Varus, led 3 legions into the forested hills of what is now northwestern Germany. His force was large, 3 full legions plus auxiliary units, and the considerable non-combat population that travelled with a Roman army on the march, including families and servants. His intelligence came from a man he trusted. Arminius, a Germanic officer who had served in Rome, held Roman citizenship, and had been awarded the rank of equestrian. The intelligence was false. Arminius was the rebellion. He had been planning it for years. What followed over 3 days in September was the most complete destruction of a Roman army in the imperial period. In difficult forested terrain where Roman tactical advantages were systematically neutralized, where formations could not deploy properly, where cavalry had no room to operate, where the Romans were attacked from all sides in conditions that made their discipline and equipment into liabilities rather than strengths. 3 legions were destroyed: the 17th, the 18th, the 19th. Varus committed suicide before he could be captured. Modern estimates place the Roman losses somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men, though the exact strength of those specific legions is debated. Ancient sources suggest the total, including auxiliaries and camp followers, may have been higher. The Roman soldiers who died in the Teutoburg forest were not buried. Not that week, not that season, not that year. Arminius made a deliberate choice to leave them where they fell. Roman officers who were captured were sacrificed in Germanic religious rites. Roman heads were nailed to trees. The skulls of the fallen were taken as trophies and kept in Germanic settlements as visible evidence of what had been accomplished. The bones of 3 legions were left to whiten in the German forest through 6 full rotations of the seasons, through 6 winters and 6 summers, while the Roman world, still processing the shock of what had happened, did not have the military strength or the political will to return and do what Roman law and Roman religion said the dead were owed. For 6 years, in 15 AD, the Roman general Germanicus Caesar, nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, one of the most gifted commanders Rome produced in the 1st century of the Principate, led a new army into Germany. His campaign had multiple strategic objectives, most of them related to stabilizing the Rhine frontier and demonstrating that Rome's capacity to project force east of the river had not been permanently broken by Teutoburg. But during that campaign, Germanicus made a deliberate diversion. He went to the Teutoburg site. The historian Tacitus, writing roughly a century after these events but drawing on earlier sources and on what appears to have been genuine historical memory, describes what Germanicus found. In the plain between the tree lines, he writes, were bleaching bones scattered or lying in small heaps as the men had fallen, whether fleeing or standing fast. Nearby were fragments of weapons and armor, bones of horses, and in the trees, skulls nailed to the trunks. Among the soldiers who had come with Germanicus to bury the dead were men who had survived the original battle, veterans who had escaped in the confusion or who had been held in Germanic captivity for years and found their way back to Roman territory. These men walked with Germanicus across the site. They guided him. Here the legates fell, they told him. There the eagles were taken. Here the first wound was dealt upon Varus. Here he died by his own hand. They showed him the altars where Roman officers had been sacrificed. They pointed to the excavated pits where prisoners had been kept before their fates were decided. They had carried the map of this place in their memory for 6 years, and now they were walking through it again. Tacitus records the emotional weight of what happened on that field without editorializing about it. He does not need to. The soldiers who were there to bury the dead did not know whose bones they were gathering. 6 years of exposure had scattered remains across a wide area. There was no way to identify individuals. The burial mound that Germanicus ordered built could not be labeled with names, because no names could be attached to what remained. The first turf was laid by Germanicus himself. Tacitus records, as an act of honor for the dead, and as consolation for the living. Consolation for the living. These are Tacitus's words. The men who buried the Teutoburg dead were not only performing a religious obligation or a political demonstration of Roman persistence, they were doing something for themselves, for the men among them who had survived and carried the memory, for the soldiers who would know, when the march continued east, that the bones of the men who had died here 6 years ago had finally been given what Roman law and Roman theology said they were owed. What Arminius had understood when he left them there was the same thing Rome had always understood when it made the same choice against its own enemies. The unburied dead were not merely dead, they were a wound that stayed open. They were a visible argument, renewed every season, about who had won and what winning cost. They were a weapon that required no maintenance once deployed, that worked on Roman morale every year they remained on that ground. Rome had used that weapon many times. In 15 AD, on a field in the Teutoburg forest, Rome received the full weight of it in return. While the field was still being worked, while the burial parties were clearing the dead, and the medical teams were treating the wounded, and the prisoner processing continued at the camp perimeter somewhere in the command structure, a different kind of operation was underway. The Roman military victory was not finished until Rome knew about it. And Rome knowing about it was not a simple matter of dispatching a fast rider with a sealed letter. After a major victory, the commanding general was expected to send a formal dispatch to the Senate. The Romans had a specific term for this document, the Litterae Lauretiae, the laurelled letter. It was a physical ritual as well as a political one. The dispatch was wrapped in a laurel wreath before being sent, the laurel being the symbol of victory that reached back to Rome's earliest military traditions and forward to the ceremony of the triumph that the letter was designed to set in motion. The men who carried it to Rome were not junior messengers. They were senior officers, men of status, who knew the commander personally, who could speak to the Senate not just as letter carriers, but as witnesses, as advocates, as evidence. Modern scholarship on how Roman military victories were communicated, including research published by Enrique Garcia Riazza on the role of what Romans called the laurelled dispatch in shaping public opinion during the Republic, has demonstrated that the quality and credibility of the men who carried the news to Rome shaped how the Senate and the Roman public received it. The letter mattered. Who brought it mattered almost as much. What was in the letter mattered most of all. Because the dispatch was not a neutral document, it was a formal request for recognition, and the recognition being requested was specific, a triumph. The triumph was the highest military honor the Roman state could bestow a public procession through the city, in a chariot, in the formal dress of a triumphator, with the spoils of war on display, and the prisoners of war in chains walking ahead. It was the public inscription of a commander's achievement into Roman civic memory. It defined careers, reinforced dynasties, and provided the political capital that Roman military service was ultimately designed to produce. Access to the triumph was formally controlled by the Senate, and the standards were real even if their application was not perfectly consistent. The historian Valerius Maximus records that the minimum threshold for a triumph required a major victory involving at least 5,000 enemy dead. The scholar Mary Beard, in her comprehensive study of the Roman triumph, argues that no single codified set of criteria ever existed that the Senate applied standards selectively, based on the political moment and the relationship between the institution and the commander seeking the honor. Both observations are probably accurate simultaneously. There was an understood standard, it was applied unevenly, which meant that a Roman commander writing his victory letter in the 48 hours after a battle was not writing dispassionate military history. He was making a case. The case of Quintus Fabius Maximus at Tarentum in 209 BC illustrates what that meant in practice. Fabius, the man Rome had called the delayer for his strategy of attrition against Hannibal after Cannae, the general who had perhaps saved the Republic by refusing to engage Hannibal in pitched battle when everyone in Rome was demanding action, had been campaigning in southern Italy when he received intelligence that the city of Tarentum could be taken. The city had gone over to Hannibal years earlier. Taking it back would be a significant achievement. The intelligence was accurate. The city could be taken. But the way it could be taken was not through direct assault. It was through the cooperation of a Brutian commander inside the city who had arranged to admit Fabius's forces. Fabius received the intelligence. Fabius used it. Tarentum fell. Then, According to Plutarch's Life of Fabius, Fabius ordered the Bruttian soldiers who had facilitated his entry killed, quietly and completely, so that no account of how the city had actually fallen would reach Rome. Plutarch does not soften his judgment. Fabius's ambition seems to have proved stronger than his principles. The cover-up worked. The victory dispatch that reached Rome described the fall of Tarentum as a military achievement. The circumstances of entry were not part of the public record. Fabius received his triumph. What the Senate recorded, what the triumph celebrated, what entered the historical tradition, it was the version of events that Fabius chose to report, not the version that had actually unfolded on the ground. This is not introduced here to condemn Fabius uniquely. It is here because it is a documented, specific case that makes visible a structural feature of the system that operated in general. The commander's post-battle dispatch was simultaneously a military report and a political document, and the gap between those two functions created pressure that operated on every commander who wrote one. Fabius managed that gap in a specific and documented way. Caesar managed it in a different way when he faced a different version of the same problem. Civil war victories over other Romans, could not, by Roman law and deep tradition, serve as the basis for a triumph. A triumph required a foreign enemy and a just war. What Caesar won at Pharsalus against Pompey and at Thapsus against Pompey's surviving allies in Africa was not that. So Caesar reframed the African campaign. The triumph he eventually held for the African War was formally presented as a victory over King Juba of Numidia, who had indeed been fighting alongside the Pompeian forces rather than over the Roman citizens who had composed the bulk of the opposing army. The Roman enemies in the picture were edited out of the official account. What remained for the triumph was a foreign king, a just war, and an unambiguous Roman victory. The Senate understood the gap between the reality and the framing. Rome was a sophisticated political culture, but the framing was accepted because the political cost of refusing to recognize Caesar's victories in the formal language of Roman civic life exceeded the political cost of accepting an accommodation that both sides knew was selective. The triumph procession itself, when it came sometimes months after the battle, sometimes longer, was the final public product of the 48-hour machine. The prisoners paraded through the streets in chains had been on the field. The spoils displayed in wagons had been catalogued in the days after the engagement. The coin that paid for the public feast that concluded the celebration had been minted, in part, from the proceeds of the post-battle auctions. The temples dedicated after the victory, the forums, the aqueducts, the covered porticos where Romans walked in the rain, all of it traced back, through the financial records of the campaign, to the work done in those 2 days. The battles are what we remember. The 48 hours are what paid for everything that followed. Now consider Arminius, and what he had and what he lacked. In 9 AD, Arminius achieved a tactical result that very few commanders in the ancient world ever managed: the effective destruction of a major Roman force in conditions largely of his choosing. 3 legions, in 4 days, with minimal losses on his own side. By any military measure, it was extraordinary. He could not convert it into strategic dominance, not immediately, not permanently. The Germanic tribal confederation under Arminius's leadership lacked almost every component of the institutional machinery that made the Roman 48 hours transformative. There was no organized slave economy waiting to process the Roman prisoners efficiently into a supply chain that would replenish labor, fund future campaigns, and feed political capital back to a metropolitan center. There was no formal dispatch system designed to translate the victory into political currency across a network of allied states and rival powers. There was no professional medical corps that would keep the Confederation's forces at full effectiveness through the winter and into the next campaign season. There was no command tent that night with a general and a scribe, carefully constructing the narrative of the victory for an audience that would decide whether to fund the next 10 years of war, based on how that narrative was framed. Arminius 1. Rome rebuilt. The legions designated the 17th, 18th, and 19th never appeared again on Roman military records. The numbers were deliberately retired, that much Rome chose to mark, a kind of institutional acknowledgement of what had been lost. But the army as a whole continued. The machine that processed each Roman victory also processed each Roman defeat, absorbed the cost, recalculated the available resources, and moved the campaign forward. Within a few years, new legions bearing new numbers were operating east of the Rhine. Within 6 years, Germanicus was back on the Teutoburg ground with enough force to bury the dead and demonstrate that Roman power had not been broken. Hannibal understood something similar about what he was facing, which is perhaps why his cavalry commander Mahabal's reported rebuke after Cannae has stayed in the historical memory as long as it has. The words that Hannibal knew how to win a victory but not how to use one may be exactly what Mahabal said, or they may be a later literary reconstruction. The debate about their authenticity continues in classical scholarship. But the observation embedded in the words is accurate regardless of their precise origin. Hannibal won at Cannae in a way that should, by almost any military logic, have ended the war. Rome's response in the Senate chamber in the days that followed was to refuse to ransom the prisoners. Hannibal now held abandoning tens of thousands of Roman men deliberately to death or slavery or captivity, because to pay ransom would be to demonstrate that Rome could be negotiated with after a catastrophic defeat. And then the Senate raised more legions. The machine did not stop for Cannae. That decision to refuse the ransom, to abandon the prisoners, to raise more armies, was brutal in the specific human terms of the families who lost their men twice, first to the battle, then to the Senate's calculation. Both things are simultaneously true. The decision was institutionally rational by the logic of a state that operated on a 48-hour cycle of processing victory and defeat into durable power, and it was devastating to the people it was made about. The machine worked because it operated on institutional logic. The institution was made of people who did not always fit that logic, and the gap between the two produced most of the tragedy in Roman military history. This is what the 48 hours reveal about Rome that the battles alone cannot. The battles are dramatic. They concentrate individual decision and human courage and human failure into a contained space of hours where individual choices visibly alter outcomes. The battles are where individual people appear most clearly in the historical record, where we can name the commanders and describe the formations and argue about the tactics. The 48 hours that followed the battles are where the institution appears most clearly, and the institution is what the empire actually was. The slave traders were there before the fighting ended. The legal framework for the transaction was established doctrine, applied hundreds of times across hundreds of years. The medical corps, once formalized by Augustus, operated with a consistency and sophistication that would not be equaled in the Western world for more than 1,000 years. The burial doctrine, anonymous mass graves for the Roman dead, deliberate weapon of non-burial against the enemy dead, was not improvisation, but established practice, applied with awareness of its religious and psychological consequences. The dispatch letter was crafted with political precision because the commander writing it understood that the 48 hours on the field were only the first part of a process that would eventually produce a triumph, or not, and that the triumph would define the rest of his life. All of this, the prisoners, the medical system, the burial parties, the political dispatch, was as much a part of the Roman military machine as the pilum and the gladius and the testudo formation. The tactics that historians reconstruct from Polybius and Caesar and Vegetius are only half the picture. The other half is what happened when the formation dissolved and the cavalry rode out and the real work of turning a battle into an empire began. If this kind of long-form, carefully researched military history is what you come here for, consider subscribing. It helps keep these documentaries coming. There are more stories like this one, the mechanisms behind the famous events, the parts of ancient history that fall between the famous names and the channel needs subscribers to build them. The field near Cannae is just a field today. The Ophidian River, now called the Ofanto, still runs near the town of Barletta in Puglia. The plain is flat and agricultural, golden in summer and brown in winter. If you walk it, there is nothing obvious to indicate what happened there in August of 216 BC. The mass graves have not been conclusively located. The bones are gone, absorbed into the landscape over 22 centuries of farming and weather and time. The anonymous majority left no markers, and the ground has kept their anonymity. At Kalkriess, in the Osnabrück hills of northern Germany, confirmed through archaeological work beginning in the 1980s and continuing to the present as the site of the Teutoburg ambush, there is now a museum and an ongoing excavation project. Archaeologists have been working the ground carefully for nearly 40 years. They have found Roman sandal fittings, pieces of lorica segmentata, bronze apron fittings, coins, and the human remains that confirmed what the site was. They work with brushes and fine tools, with GPS coordinates for each artifact, with careful documentation and preservation procedures. The objects go into climate-controlled storage. The data goes into databases. The work continues. They are excavating ground where men from the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions fell in September of 9 AD and lay unburied for 6 years, where Germanicus arrived in 15 AD with new soldiers and old survivors and built a burial mound from what could be gathered. The gentleness of the modern scientific process, the careful brush, the labeled plastic bag, the database entry is not a contrast to what created the site. It is, in its own way, a continuation of the impulse that Germanicus was acting on, to account for the dead, to give the bones the attention that the system, 2,000 years ago, did not have the capacity or the time, or in some cases, the willingness to give. The Roman Empire was built, in part, on the 48 hours, on the slave traders at the perimeter, and the capsarii in the field, and the surgeons working by lamplight, and the burial parties working without ceremony, and the commander composing his dispatch with one eye on the triumph he needed, and the other on the field where the work was not yet done, on the deliberate choices about whose dead would be honored and whose would be left as a warning, on the letter that shaped the historical record before the blood had dried. The medical knowledge built in Roman field, hospitals refined by Celsus, extended by Galen, who learned surgical technique partly at a gladiatorial school and partly at military stations along the frontier, remained the standard reference for Western medicine for more than 1,000 years after the last Roman emperor in the West had been deposed. The practical knowledge of how to treat traumatic wounds, how to manage infection, how to perform amputations and trepanations that the patient might survive, was accumulated in the valetudinarium in the 48 hours after battle, repeated hundreds of times across hundreds of campaigns, and codified into texts that outlasted the civilization that produced them. The political architecture of the triumph, with its careful management of how victories were communicated and which narratives reached the Senate, and how the historical record was framed, shaped the sources we use today to reconstruct the ancient world. The way we understand Cannae and Zama and Pydna and Alesia traces back through the chain of ancient texts to dispatches written at campaign tables in the 2 days after each engagement ended. The history we have is partly the history that Roman commanders decided to send home. We have named the battles. We have built museums and written books and made documentaries about them. We have studied the tactics and debated the numbers and argued about whether Hannibal should have marched on Rome and whether Caesar's Gallic campaigns were conquest or something worse, and whether Augustus was a revolutionary or a conservative who disguised his revolution as the restoration of tradition. The battles and the commanders and the turning points, these are the part of the story that history chose to remember and repeat. The machine that followed every battle is the part that built what history was recording. Rome did not become Rome because it fought well. Almost every empire in the ancient world had armies that fought well, at least for a time. Rome became Rome because of what it did when the fighting stopped. Because it had a system imperfect, brutal, shaped by the values and blind spots of its culture, but consistent and institutional, and operated by people who understood that a victory was only the beginning of the real work. The 48 hours, almost never discussed, almost always decisive. Tell me in the comments which part of this changes how you see Rome. The prisoner processing, the medical system, the burial choices, the political dispatch. I'm genuinely curious which piece lands differently than you expected. These old stories travel a long way, and I always want to know where they end up.